happened in here? It's kind of embarrassing. I'd really love to blame someone for this, but unfortunately I'm a one-man shop. Oh yeah, that's much better. Hey, welcome to my shop. You guys may know me as a guy who built a big ball out of plywood, but primarily I'm a cabinet maker. I started in business in 1992, and for a year or so I worked out of my dad's garage. He was a machinist at Caterpillar, but he did woodworking in his spare time for a hobby. So growing up in his shop, I learned a lot about the trade. He taught me how to build a raised panel door, how to read a tape measure, how to read a micrometer. So a lot of my knowledge I gained just by kind of being around him and getting in his way. So after about a year of working in that small shop, I realized I was running out of space. So I decided to build my own shop. With the help of my brother and my dad, we did every phase of construction here, from the concrete to the framing to the drywall. Well, after a few years of construction, I moved all of my tools into this shop. The building itself is 30 by 40, and I've got a lot of tools stuffed in here. So almost everything is on mobile bases, so I can roll them away from the wall when I want to use them. And one thing I didn't like in the smaller shop, I didn't have near enough light. So in this building, I put in 8 skylights and a ton of overhead shop lights. Let's start the rest of the tour. I'm going to take you around and show you some of the machines I use. The machines I really like and have worked well for me over the years, I'm going to point those out, and I'll put a link in the description of the video below. So if you want to check them out later, you can. Let's get started here on the back wall where all the materials come in. This overhead door is where all my materials come in and go out of the shop. I've got a forklift, so when I bring in plywood, I can put long forks on it and bring the plywood in long ways. I can take it right off the stack and put it into my plywood racks. On the end here, I have all my 1/4-inch material stacked up so I can pull out each sheet individually if I have to. The problem with these shelves are they're kind of a junk catcher. So a lot of my cut off scraps and stuff will go here. You just have to kind of keep on top of it to keep the scraps down, or they will get overwhelming. All of my hardwood lumber is stacked here on the end wall. In my small shop, I had everything on shelves. So if I needed to get a board off at the bottom of the stack, I had to move the whole pile. So here I have everything stacked on its end. I've got 16 foot in the center, but most of the stuff I buy is 12 foot or under. So if I need a board out of this pile, I can reach back, get the one board out of there, I happen to carry the rest of them. These are called bow tie clamps. It's a tool that I invented for building balls, but I actually use them quite a bit here for organizing my lumber wall. Keeps the piles together and keeps it from getting spread out and tangled together. All of my hardwood lumber and plywood gets broken down in the center of my shop. I've got my joiner, my table saw, and my crosscut saw. It's a Delta sawbuck. This saw has been around quite a while. The reason I like it, it has a 16-inch crosscut, which is a lot more than most saws have. I've got roller stands on either end of it I can pull out for cutting long stock. Another thing, I was able to drill a 4-inch dust collector line into the back of the table. So it has really good dust collection capacity. I would say 98% of the dust goes straight down the pipe. So after I cross-cut things to length, I take them over to the joiner. This is my joiner. It's a Delta 8-inch, and the reason I bought this was the bed is a lot longer than most. And this was on a 4-inch base. I took that off and lowered it down so that it could sit at the end of my table saw cutoff table. So if I have a piece of 1/4-inch plywood or something on the table saw and it's hanging off the end a little bit, it'll scoot right over the fence, and it's exactly the same height as that table. I love this machine. The only thing I would change, I may upgrade to a spiral segmented cutter head. Other than that, this is a rock solid machine. Let's go over to the table saw. My table saw is a 3 horsepower Delta unit saw. And this saw has been with me since the beginning. And I actually sold my dirt bike to pay for this saw. And although I missed my KX500, this saw has been a lot of fun also. I've got 16 feet of in feed on the front side, and I've got 16 plus on the back side. Big tables for cutting plywood, quite a bit of outfeed table. This saw works really well for me. I've had to replace the motor, I've had to replace the switch, and the bearings are starting to make noise now, so it may be time for an upgrade. As far as blades go, I use 2 different kinds of blades. I use a cheaper $40 blade for a lot of my cutting. If I'm cutting MDF or barnwood or just any rough lumber, I'll use a cheaper carbide blade. But for the majority of my cabinet work, I use this blade here. It's a Forest Woodworker 2, 40 tooth, and I prefer the full 1/8 inch kerf blade. And a lot of people will say that's a really expensive blade. It's like $140, but it's worth every penny. If you're doing any kind of face frame work, the cut on the side of your face frame is so smooth with this blade, you will save many hours of sanding. You will pay for this blade in one small job. I also use a Forest 6-inch flat stabilizer on the side of this blade, but this stabilizer will make even this cheaper blade cut 10 times better, and they last a long time. So let's go over now to the big ball sander. So this is the big ball sander. About 12 years ago, I built my first big wooden ball. And it sat in the corner of my shop for quite a while. I didn't have any way to turn it. I didn't have a big lathe. I didn't have any way to spin it to sand it smooth. So I designed this machine. I made this so it could turn anywhere from 8 inches up to 36 inches in diameter. The tailstock will move out. The bed will drop down to accommodate the larger stuff. So how it works, the ball basically just spins between centers, and the arm rotates around a center point from below. Has a 4-inch angle grinder. It's adjustable for tilt and in and out, and just the process of sanding as it's spinning. Because this disc rotates and it throws all of the sanding dust right down inside this tube, so there's very little dust that escapes that. But I've also got this filter behind here. I just took a squirrel cage fan and enclosed it and put filters on it, and that captures a lot of the fine dust and it pulls it back away from me. So if you come around here to the end, I've got a 1/2 horsepower 3-phase motor, and it's got a 30-to-1 gear reducer on top of it. So what that does is that I have a pretty high torque, 0 to 60 RPM coming out of the spindle. And this 3-phase motor is run by a variable frequency drive, which converts the single-phase power coming in to the 3-phase for the motor down here. And in the video, it looks like I'm really turning these pretty fast, but I'm only starting at about 5 RPM on the spindle speed. I'm just knocking off all the high spots until it gets round, till all the bumps are gone, and then I'll turn it up 30 plus RPM for the finished sanding. And that works pretty well. I built this lathe and I've taken it back apart several times and made improvements to it. I think I've got it to where I want it now. So I'm looking forward to doing some more big ball stuff and putting that on video for you guys. So coming on down the line here, I've got my air compressor, 5 horsepower, 80 gallon. It's a little bit oversized for what I need now. I used to use a lot more pneumatic tools, but still a good unit. Drill press, pretty standard stuff. Below the drill press, I've got a bank of drawers I built. I'd love to show you the inside of these drawers and have you see a really organized setup, but I will show you my junk. Just don't tell anybody. Down from the drill press is my pocket hole machine. This is a Craig DK. It's all air powered. I believe the newer ones they have now are all electric. This one is activated by a foot pedal, and it's got a air powered clamp that comes down. So and you can set these flip stops for your different widths of face frames. I use this thing a ton in the shop. I really like pocket holes. I use them quite a bit. Over here is my cart with all my pipe clamps. I've got about 500 pounds of clamps on this 300-pound Harbor Freight shop cart, but I find it's easier to just roll them over to the workbench when I need them and then roll them back out of my way. Over here on this wall, I've got my double chop saw set up that I use for cutting triangles to make balls. Just a couple of off-the-rack DeWalt 716 chop saws. It's one of my favorite saws. I've got them bolted to a plank, and I've got them connected with a custom fence. And the fence has flip stops on both sides, so I can cut triangles anywhere from 1 inches to 7 inches. The saws are always like this. I have one set up for left and one set up for right, and I only use this for that operation. When I'm using them, I put them over here on my sanding table. I don't have a dedicated chop saw station, so I'll just throw my saw on here when I need to use it, and I've got stops that fit into the table. This is the saw that usually rides around the back of my truck. This is my sanding table. I designed and built this table 25 years ago when I first started in this shop. And believe it or not, in those 25 years, I have never cleaned the filters in this machine. The beauty of the design is the filters are self-cleaning. Let me show you inside, and I can show you what I'm talking about. These are the same style of filters that are used in industrial baghouse collectors. I use these same filters on my dust collector. And they're pretty much self-cleaning. How this table works is there's a big squirrel cage fan or a blower out of a furnace in here. And when it's all closed up, the only way that fan can get any air is to suck it down through the top of the table and through these filters. There's 12 of these filters in here, so there's an incredible amount of surface area of filter material. So then the air gets sucked through the fan and it gets blown out either end of the table. As the cake of dust builds up inside each one of these filters, as it's turned on and off, the cake will break off and it'll fall into this channel on each side. So about once a month or so, I'll take this 8-foot piece of conduit out of here and I'll screw it onto this pusher, and this pusher will push the dust all the way to the other end of the table. I'll take you down there and show you that. So this is where all the dust comes out. I put a dustpan down here, and all the dust will fall out, and I can clean it with a shop vac or whatnot. But you can see in there that all the dust is in round piles where it fell out at the bottom of the filter, because the bottom of the filter is open. So let me give you a demonstration. This is my main random orbit sander. It's a Mirka Ceros 6-inch DC powered random orbit sander. And this first came out in like 2009, 2010. And at the time I was using a right angle sander, which was $125 or so. And this was almost $500. And I thought about it and I went ahead and bought it. But here I am 10 years later. I'm using the same sander. I use it almost every day in my shop. And believe it or not, this is still the original pad that came with it. It's still flat as can be. Really impressed with the Mirka brand. The only drawback to this one was it had a large transformer box that I have stashed up here. But they make a new model of this called the Mercaderos. It's a direct plug-in. The transformer is built in up here somewhere, and you don't have that transformer box. So when this one quits on me, I will definitely buy the Deros. I just can't get this one to quit. It won't stop running. It's made of iron. I have nothing bad to say about it. It's a really high quality piece of machinery. I've got a 3-inch dust collector line here on top of the table that I use for some of my routers, my router table, just general cleaning of the dust here. And I have it on a swing arm that I built so I can travel all the way around the table. It's kind of like a car wash. And when I'm not using it, I can just kind of push it out of the way. My random orbit sander has a dust extractor hooked to it. So this dust tube goes up overhead and it comes down into this box here. This box is another custom filter that I built. It has a 4-foot tube filter, just like the ones on my dust table here. And so the dust comes down, goes to the inside of that filter, and when it builds up enough, the cake will break off and fall down into this box down here. So to clean it, all I have to do, open this drawer up, and you can see the fine flour powder in the bottom of here. So none of that fine dust ever gets to my dust extractor. That is the fine turbo dust extractor. I just bought it. It's only a couple months old, but I'm replacing a fine Turbo 2 that I had here before. And I stuck with the fine brand because I got 25 years out of the Turbo 2, using it almost every day. Granted, it's going through a better filter system, but that vacuum just lasted forever, and I'm really pleased with the performance of it. This one is under $300, and it has one of the highest CFM values in its class. It has the auto start tool feature, and it's made by Fine, so you know it's a pretty high quality piece of equipment. So here next to my sanding table is my main bench. I do all my glue ups and assembly here. It's a 4x8 bench, and I just keep a piece of 1/8-inch hardboard on top of it as a bench cover. So when I get glue and stuff on top of it, I just throw that away. It's just a cheap protection for the top. Underneath, again, it's some more junk, but I've got pullouts here where I've got my sandpaper and screws, a lot of miscellaneous storage. So I've got 8 doors in this bench, and each one of them has 2 pullouts for stuff. If you come over here to my bulletin board, you'll see that I am the best dad and the MVP. Some little things my daughter brought over to me. She is 13 now, but I'm still trying to keep her involved in the shop. My son, was in the military and he's on his own now. When he was working in here in high school, sanding and doing stuff for me, he didn't always appreciate it like he should, but now that he's out on his own, he's a carpenter, and I think he now appreciates and understands some of the skills that he learned when he was younger. Over here I've got some cubby shelves at the end of my bench. It's where I keep all my routers, nail guns, some of the smaller power tools. And I like to use laminate trimmers. I've got 4 of these Porter Cable 310 laminate trimmers, and I keep my smaller bits, 1/8-inch round over, 1/4-inch round over, flush trim. Those smaller bits, I don't have to change them all the time, so I just leave them in there, and saves me time changing bits. Here I've got my mechanics toolbox, and again, I wish it was more organized. I can show you 2 of the drawers. I can show you the pencil drawer, pencils, drill bits, other kinds of bits in here. And I can show you the donkey drawer. I've got, I don't go crazy on cordless tools. I've got a 12-volt Hitachi I use for all my smaller bench work, face frame screws, and a 20-volt DeWalt. I do like this Bosch multi-angle close quarter drill for getting in tight spaces. The rest of this, portable power tools, jigsaw, circular saws. Along the outside wall, I have a walker table. And I use that quite a bit for if I have a long glue up on my bench, or if I'm cutting small parts in the bandsaw, just a nice little place to set stuff off to the side. All of these tools on this long wall are on rollers, so I can pull them out as needed, one at a time, and use them and then push them back. 6x48 belt sander with a 12-inch disc on the outside, 14-inch Delta bandsaw. I use that for all of my my smaller scroll work. This Delta wood shaper here I've got set up for, it's got a coping pattern set in it for door frames, and that's pretty much all I use it for. My Grizzly 20-inch planer. Now this is not a real glamorous machine. But it works. It's a heavy-duty planer. I've had it since I believe 96, and it does what it's supposed to do. It was really inexpensive, and if I only could do one thing, I'll probably upgrade to a spiral segmented cutter head on this also, but it really doesn't need anything. It's a lot cheaper than most of the competition, and it's a pretty well-made machine. I have a Williams & Hussey molder, and I run a lot of molding through this. I don't do a lot of production molding, so when I'm building something, I maybe 25 to 50 feet of trim at a time. If I'm doing some walnut or some cherry, I will use this machine. I do a lot of shelf edge with it, and I have customers that come in and they have a molding they're trying to match from an old house. So I do have a lot of custom cutters that I've built. I do my own crowns and coves and stuff like that. But it's a pretty nice little machine to have when you need it. Again, all these things in the middle here that have longer stock running through them, I can just run them out by themselves, and I still have 20 feet of in-feed and out-feed on this. Sunhill 24-inch wide belt sander. I bought this the time I didn't have like $10,000 to spend on one, so this was right around the $5,000 range. And also, I don't have three-phase power here, so at the time this was the biggest machine that I could get single-phase power, and it works pretty well. It's pretty heavy-duty, well-made cast iron machine. If I had my dream machine, it'd probably be a 36 wide, but for now, that works fine for me. One of my newest machines is this Grizzly 19-inch 3-horsepower bandsaw. I bought this when I started doing a lot more resawing when building the balls, and I normally keep it with a 3/4 or a 1-inch resaw blade. I've got a little thin blade in it now that I use I did some scroll work on some bigger stock. But I designed and built this resaw feeder, and it's based roughly the design on one that Laguna Tools made many years ago. They may still make it, but it uses a 6x48 sanding belt, and it's got a little gear motor that turns the belt, and that's adjustable for speed. This little contraption here keeps the wood pressed up against the belt, and it's adjustable here for the drift of the blade. And I will use this. I've got a video coming up where I'm going to do some resawing, and I'll put this in there and I'll show how it's used. But 2 cranks of this handle advances this 1/16 inch. That's the piece you're left with. So 4 cranks is an 1/8 inch. And next to that is a Grizzly 3 horsepower shaper. This is actually one of the only major power tools left out of my dad's original shop. And this is a Grizzly from 1983. And this came from when the Grizzly catalog was like 4 Xerox pages stapled together. And now the Grizzly catalog is like 1.5 inches thick. But if you remember in 1983, Grizzly tools were not real high quality machines. In fact, the fence that came with this was just junk. We just threw it away. But my dad was really happy to have this machine, and he did a lot of raised panels. He'd have this thing out in the driveway every weekend, just making huge piles of dust and waking up the whole town. But he loved this machine, and it does what it's supposed to do. It's not fancy, but compared to the new Grizzly stuff, is a ton better quality. A lot of their machines are made in the ISO 9001 factory, which means it's a lot better quality control. And I bought this machine a couple of years ago, and I've gone through it, and I haven't found a thing wrong with it. It's a pretty well built machine, and it's still about half the price of some of the competitors. And so I like the new Grizzly stuff. And finally, on the end here is my Grizzly oscillating spindle sander. Again, not a glamorous machine, but it does what it's supposed to do. If you're doing any kind of inside radius work, it saves a lot of time. And I know I told you guys I don't have a lot of real high-end equipment in this shop, but there is one exception here. Most guys just have regular radios in their shop, but I have a SUPERRADIO, AM, FM. This thing really pumps the sound out. So, I'm not trying to brag or anything, but it is pretty sweet. So last but not least is this big sucker. This is a 3 horsepower Cyclone dust collector, and we've got a 7-inch main line up there hooked to all the different machines that comes into it. So all of the dust comes into the Cyclone, gets swirled around, and about 98% of the biggest dust will fall to the bottom of the Cyclone and into this barrel. We've got plastic bags in there, you can just pull those out and get rid of that dust. Just the super fine dust will flow in and into the filter bank. So these filters are just like the ones that I used in my sanding table and my dust extractor filter. It's an industrial baghouse filter, it's a polyester felt. And as these blow up, all of that cake of the fine dust from the inside of them will fall down and into this drawer at the bottom. So you can see here that's just the very fine powdery dust. And I only have to open this drawer probably once a month, if that. So each individual machine has a hose that comes down to a blast gate. And there's a 24 volt switch back here, a micro switch, that turns on a low voltage contactor up at the dust collector. So when you open the gate, it turns the machine on. So every machine has that. That way you don't forget and leave blast gates open. And so, because every open blast gate's reducing the amount of suction you have. So that reminds you to close them, and it's just easier than going back and forth to a switch or using a remote. So that's pretty much it. Thanks for taking the tour and walking around my shop with me. I'm working on some new stuff, so we'll see you in the next video.